The smell was the only thing Vashti had left. It was a ghost, a promise of a life that had failed to materialize. It drifted from the small adobe oven behind her shack, a scent of yeast and hearth and hope, so potent it almost felt like a lie. It curled through the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch, a town that had long ago forgotten what hope smelled like. It was the scent of her mother's kitchen, of mornings before the world had gone wrong. Here, it was just an insult, a reminder of the soft things the desert baked out of a person. She leaned against the rough-hewn counter she'd set up, a single plank of wood resting on two barrels. On it sat 4 loaves of bread, their crusts a deep, burnished brown, their insides a cloud of tender crumb. They were perfect. They were the culmination of the last of her flour, the last of her firewood, and the very last of her resolve. For 3 weeks, she had baked. For 3 weeks, the town had watched, sniffed, and walked on by. Her shack was at the edge of town, where the respectable part of Redemption Gulch crumbled into scrub and dust. It was a place for things that were broken or unwanted, and she fit right in. She had arrived 2 months prior, a widow whose husband had coughed his last breath into the canvas of their wagon a day's ride from this place. The wagon train had given her what condolences they could spare, and moved on. Leaving her with a cast-iron oven her husband had insisted on hauling west and a sourdough starter in a clay crock, a living inheritance from a mother-in-law she'd never met. She had thought it would be enough. She thought a town full of men living on hardtack and greasy bacon would welcome the taste of real bread. She hadn't counted on Mrs. Gable. The woman was the town's axle, and everything and everyone turned around her. She owned the general store, the boarding house, and the town's opinion. Mrs. Gable sold flour at an inflated price and biscuits that could break a tooth. Vashti's bread was a threat, not just to her profits, but to the established order of things. A woman alone, with no husband or father to speak for her, was not supposed to create something so full of life. Mrs. Gable made her morning promenade down the street, her black bombazine dress sweeping the dust into little clouds. She paused before Vashti's stall, her nose wrinkling as if the scent of fresh bread was something foul. She did not look at Vashti, but at the town at large, her voice carrying like a preacher's. "Some things look good on the outside," she announced to the empty air. "But you don't know where they've been. You don't know what kind of hands have touched them. Unclean hands make for unclean bread." Vashti's own hands curled into fists beneath her counter. They were chapped and flour-dusted, the knuckles raw from scrubbing and kneading. They were clean. They were the only things in her life that felt honest. She said nothing. To speak would be to give the woman a fight she wanted, and Vashti had no fight left. She just watched as Mrs. Gable continued on her way, the silent verdict delivered. A few faces peered from windows and doorways, then disappeared. The street was empty again, save for her and the mocking, beautiful smell of her bread. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her head. The loaves on the counter began to lose their warmth. Despair was a physical thing, a cold stone in her stomach. She had failed. She would have to sell the oven for pennies, just to get enough money for a stagecoach ticket to nowhere. The thought was a surrender so complete it made her dizzy. That's when she heard it. The slow, steady clip-clop of a single horse, not the hurried gait of a townsman, but the patient rhythm of a long rider. A man rode into town from the west, the direction of endless, empty land. He was a silhouette against the blinding sun, broad-shouldered and still in the saddle. He rode a big buckskin that looked as tired and dust-caked as he did. He was just a drifter, she thought, another man passing through. But he didn't ride past. He stopped his horse in the middle of the street, his head turning, sniffing the air like a wolf catching a scent on the wind. His gaze, shadowed by the brim of a stained hat, settled on her small stall. He swung down from the horse, his movements economical and weary. He was tall, dressed in trail-worn leather and denim faded to the color of the sky. Spurs chimed softly on his boots as he walked, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent street. He didn't look at her face, but at the loaves of bread. The town was watching. She could feel their eyes on her back. They were waiting to see what this stranger would do. He stopped in front of her counter, the smell of leather and dust and horse sweat mingling with the yeast of her bread. He was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He looked like a man who had seen too much and said too little. "Smells like my mother's kitchen," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse. It was the first time a man had spoken to her in this town without pity or suspicion. "It's for sale," she managed, her own voice tight. He looked at the 4 loaves, then his eyes finally met hers. They were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter storm. There was a profound stillness in them, a deep, banked-down sorrow. He looked at her, truly looked, and she felt a jolt of connection so sharp it was like a pain. He saw her. Not the poor widow, not the town outcast. Just a woman with something to sell. "I'll have a slice," he said, his gaze dropping back to the bread. She took her knife, the blade worn thin from use, and cut a thick slice from the end of a loaf. The crust crackled, releasing a fresh puff of steam. She handed it to him. Her hand trembled slightly. He took the slice, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock of warmth up her arm. He raised the bread, looked at it for a long moment, then took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed. His jaw worked, and a muscle feathered along his cheek. A change came over his face. The hard lines seemed to soften. The deep, settled grief in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else. A memory. A longing. A flicker of life in a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He swallowed. He opened his eyes and looked at her again, and this time, the stillness was gone. There was a raw, aching vulnerability there that stole her breath. "How much?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "For the loaf?" she asked. 5 cents. He shook his head, taking another bite of the slice. "No. For the oven." Vashti stared at him. The question made no sense. It was a madness born of sun and dust. "Mister, the oven's not for sale, it's all I have." "Everything's for sale," he said, his voice flat, but the look in his eyes was not. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt and untied the thong. He poured a cascade of gold coins onto the rough wooden plank of her counter. The sound was a thunderclap in the quiet street. There was more money on her stall than she had seen in her entire life. It was a fortune. It was an absurdity. "That's for the oven," he said. He pushed the pile of coins toward her. "And this," he added, pulling out a handful of silver dollars and placing them beside the gold, "is for every loaf of bread you can bake between now and the first snow. You'll deliver them to the Circle C Ranch. Ask for Emmett." He turned without waiting for an answer, as if the matter was settled beyond all discussion. He swung up onto his horse, the buckskin sighing under his weight. He looked down at her one last time, his gray eyes holding hers. "Don't let the fire go out," he said. And then he was gone, riding west, leaving her standing in a cloud of dust with a fortune on her counter, and the stunned, covetous eyes of Redemption Gulch burning into her back. The bread suddenly felt heavy in her hands, no longer a failure, but a weapon. She didn't know if he had just saved her or condemned her. The town's silence broke. A murmur rippled from the doorways and windows. Vashti quickly swept the coins into her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of the gold was terrifying. It was a brand. Mrs. Gable stood on the porch of her store, her face a mask of thunderous disbelief. Her reign had been challenged, not by a man with a gun, but by a drifter with a taste for good bread. Vashti packed up her remaining loaves, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the cloth around them. She didn't sell the oven. She understood his words now. It wasn't a purchase. It was an investment. A command. Don't let the fire go out. He hadn't bought her oven. He had bought her a future. She retreated into her shack, barred the door, and leaned against it, the heavy coins a cold comfort against her stomach. For the first time in months, she did not know what the next day would bring, and for the first time in months, that felt like a beginning. The next morning, Vashti was up before the sun, her purpose renewed. The gold and silver were hidden beneath a loose floorboard, but the real treasure was the contract. A purpose. She stoked the embers in the oven, the familiar scent of wood smoke a comfort. Using the money Emmett had left, she had been able to buy flour, a whole sack of it, from a freighter passing through, avoiding the need to face Mrs. Gable's vindictive stare in the general store. She worked with a feverish energy, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of kneading, shaping, and baking. This was not baking for survival anymore. It was baking to fulfill a promise. She had to prove that his faith, however strangely expressed, was not misplaced. By mid-morning, a dozen perfect loaves cooled on her counter. She wrapped 6 of them in clean linen, packed them in a basket, and set out to find the Circle C. The directions she'd gotten from the freighter were simple. Follow the creek west until the valley opened up. She walked, not wanting to spend her newfound money on a horse just yet. The walk was long, the sun hot, but the basket was a steady weight in her arms, a solid reassurance. The Circle C was not just a ranch, it was a kingdom. It sprawled across the entire valley, a vast expanse of grazing land dotted with cattle. The ranch house was a sturdy 2-story timber building, a fortress of self-reliance against the wilderness. It was clear that the man called Emmett was no simple drifter. He was powerful. The thought made her stomach clench. What had she gotten herself into? A group of ranch hands watched her approach from the shade of the barn. Their faces were hard, skeptical. They looked her up and down, their eyes lingering on the basket. A woman walking from town was a strange sight. "Lost, ma'am?" one of them asked, a grizzled man with a suspicious squint. "I'm looking for a Mr. Emmett," she said, her voice steady. "I have a delivery." The man grunted, exchanging a look with his companions. "The boss don't get deliveries." "He will now," she said, holding her ground. Just then, Emmett emerged from the barn. He had shed his trail dust and wore a clean shirt, but he still had the same air of contained solitude. The lines of his face were just as harsh in the bright light of his own land. He saw her, and his expression didn't change, but the ranch hands immediately straightened up, their skepticism dissolving into deference. "Leave her be," Emmett said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. His gray eyes assessed her, then the basket. "You came." "I keep my word," she replied. "So do I." He took the basket from her. His fingers brushed hers again, and this time the jolt was familiar, a low hum of electricity. He unwrapped the linen and looked at the bread. A flicker of something, satisfaction, maybe something softer, crossed his face before it was gone. "Cook will take this. You'll bring the same amount every day. At sundown, one of my men will leave payment and your empty basket by the cottonwood at the edge of town." It was a business transaction, cold, efficient. It kept them separate. It kept her out of his world. She felt a strange pang of disappointment. "All right," she said. He turned to go, then paused. "The men," he said, gesturing to the hands who were now trying to look busy. "They eat what I tell them to eat. But they're a stubborn bunch. They might need convincing." It was a warning. Or maybe a challenge. She watched him walk toward the house, his back straight and unyielding. She understood. He had given her an opportunity, but he would not clear the path for her. She had to earn her place here, just as she had to in town. The proving began the next day. She left the bread at the appointed time and found the payment and basket waiting for her. This went on for a week. She never saw Emmett, only the anonymous exchange at the cottonwood tree. But she heard the whispers when she walked through Redemption Gulch. They called her the Drifter's Baker. They said she was a kept woman, that her bread was just an excuse. Mrs. Gable's lies had found fertile ground. Then, one afternoon, as she was gathering wood behind her shack, she found a stack of perfectly split, seasoned piñon pine, far more than she could have gathered in a week. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. But she knew. It was his silent acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. He was watching over her, from a distance. Her own response came a few days later. The ranch hand who dropped off the basket had a fresh gash on the back of his hand, ugly and beaded with dirt. The next morning, tucked inside the linen wrapping the bread, Vashti placed a small tin of salve she had made from comfrey root and tallow. It was the kind of remedy her mother had used for scrapes and burns. It was a small thing, a piece of her old life offered into her new one. The following evening, the basket was waiting as usual, but tied to the handle with a piece of twine was a single, perfect eagle feather. She picked it up, tracing its sharp, clean lines. It was a thank you. It was a message in a language of silence they were beginning to build together. The slow burn of their connection was forged in these small, unspoken exchanges. She began to look forward to the walk to the cottonwood, her heart beating a little faster as she approached, wondering if she might catch a glimpse of him, or if there would be some new small sign. She learned to read the tracks around the tree, to know if it was his horse or one of his men's. One evening, a storm blew in, a sudden violent squall that turned the dusty street to a river of mud. The wind tore at her small shack, and she feared for her oven. She was struggling to lash a canvas tarp over it when a figure emerged from the deluge. It was Emmett. He was soaked to the bone, his hat dripping, his face set. He didn't say a word. He simply took the rope from her cold, numb fingers and expertly secured the tarp, his knots swift and sure. She stood beside him, shivering, the rain plastering her thin dress to her skin. When he was done, he turned to her. In the flash of lightning, she saw the concern in his eyes. "You should have a proper roof for it," he said, his voice a low growl against the thunder. "I manage," she said, her teeth chattering. He reached out, not to touch her, but to pull the collar of her dress closer to her throat, a gesture of almost paternal care. But his fingers brushed the skin of her neck, and the touch was anything but paternal. It was fire and ice. They both froze, the rain and wind roaring around them, creating a small, isolated world for just the two of them. His hand lingered for a heartbeat too long. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the callous texture of his fingertips. She saw the storm in his eyes mirror the one in the sky. He was fighting something within himself, a battle she was only just beginning to understand. Then he pulled his hand back, as if burned. He took a step away, breaking the spell. "The bread was good today," he said gruffly, turning to leave. The words were abrupt, a clumsy attempt to return to the safety of their business arrangement. "Emmett," she called out over the wind. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but clear. He gave a slight nod and disappeared into the rain, leaving her with a racing heart and the lingering ghost of his touch on her skin. She retreated into her shack, the cold no longer reaching her bones. A different kind of warmth had taken root, a dangerous, fragile thing that felt an awful lot like hope. She now knew his damage was deep, a wall built of old pain. And she was beginning to realize, with a terrifying certainty, that she wanted to be the one to see what was on the other side. The next morning, 2 of his ranch hands were at her shack with a wagon full of lumber and tools. They didn't speak to her, just tipped their hats and set to work building a small, sturdy lean-to over her oven. They worked with quiet efficiency, and by noon, her oven was sheltered beneath a solid wooden roof. It was another message from him, another brick in the strange, silent house they were building between them. Her bread had won over the Circle C. The grizzled foreman who had first challenged her now gave her a curt nod of respect when he saw her. The younger hands made jokes about getting fat on her cooking. She had earned her place there, not through Emmett's power, but through her own skill and persistence. But in town, things were getting worse. Her small success was a constant irritation to Mrs. Gable. The woman's whispers grew louder, more venomous. She started a rumor that Vashti's husband hadn't died of fever, but of a shameful disease. Then she insinuated that he had run from the law and that Vashti was no better than a common criminal's accomplice. The lies were like burrs, sticking to the fabric of the town's suspicion. People crossed the street to avoid her. The preacher, a man whose piety was a cloak for his own cruelty, began to make veiled references in his sermons to the wages of sin and women of loose morals, his eyes always finding Vashti where she sat alone in the back pew. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her work, on the quiet communication with Emmett. But the poison was seeping in, making her feel dirty, ashamed. She felt the isolation closing in again, tighter this time because she had something to lose. One afternoon, she was in the general store, her head held high, to buy thread. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, a smug, satisfied look on her face. "Well, look what the wind blew in," the woman said loudly, for the benefit of the other customers. "Come to spend your drifter's money, have you?" Vashti placed a coin on the counter. "I need a spool of black thread, please." Mrs. Gable picked up the coin and held it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "You know, a friend of mine is a clerk back in St. Louis. He has access to all sorts of records. Warrants, for example. It's amazing what you can find out about people who run from their past. People with husbands who had debts." The threat was clear, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. Vashti's blood ran cold. Her husband, bless his flawed heart, had been a gambler. He had left behind a trail of debts and angry men. She had thought they were free of it, that his death had wiped the slate clean. But Mrs. Gable had found a lever, and she was preparing to use it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vashti said, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, I think you do," Mrs. Gable purred, "and I think the sheriff will be very interested to hear about it. A town like ours needs to maintain a certain standard." Vashti grabbed the spool of thread and fled the store, the woman's mocking laughter following her out into the street. Panic seized her. She had been a fool to think she could start over. The past was never gone. It just waited for someone to dig it up. Worse than the fear for herself was the fear for Emmett. She was tying him to her shame, to her husband's sordid history. His quiet protection, his silent gestures of kindness, had made him a target. The town's gossip now linked them inextricably. Her disgrace would become his. The thought was unbearable. He had built a fortress of solitude around his own grief, and she had breached it, only to lead his enemies to the gate. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by her cold oven, the new roof a testament to a kindness she felt she didn't deserve. She had to protect him from her. The only way to do that was to disappear. The decision was a shard of ice in her heart, but it was clear. She had arrived with nothing, and she would leave the same way. Before the first hint of dawn, she packed her few belongings into a small bundle. She took none of the money he had given her. That was for the bread, and she would not be baking anymore. She left it under the floorboard. She wrote a short, simple note, her hand shaking as she formed the words. "Thank you. I'm sorry for the trouble." She left the note on the counter where her loaves usually sat, weighted down by the eagle feather he had given her. She looked one last time at the oven, a dark, hulking shape in the pre-dawn gloom. It had been her salvation and her downfall. With a sob catching in her throat, she slipped out of the shack and walked away from Redemption Gulch, melting into the gray darkness that comes just before the morning. Emmett found the note an hour later. He had ridden to the cottonwood at dawn, a habit he'd developed, just to see the light hit her side of town. When he saw no smoke from her chimney, a cold knot of dread formed in his gut. He rode to her shack, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The place was cold, empty. The note on the counter felt like a death sentence. He read the words, and the wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart for years didn't just crack, it shattered. The pain was sharp, familiar. It was the same hollowed-out emptiness he'd felt the morning he woke up a widower. He had let someone in, just a crack, and she had been torn away from him. He sank onto the stool by the counter, his head in his hands, the eagle feather pressing into his palm. His first instinct was to retreat, to ride back to his ranch, lock the gates, and let the silence swallow him whole again. It was the safe thing to do. It was the thing he knew. But then, a rage he hadn't felt in years began to burn through the grief. This was not fate. This was not sickness. This was the petty cruelty of small-minded people. This was Mrs. Gable. He had stood by and watched them poison the one good thing that had come into his life, his silence a form of complicity. He had tried to protect her from a distance, with wood and money and roofs, but he hadn't protected her with the one thing that mattered: his voice, his presence. He stood up, his decision made. He would not lose someone he cared for again. Not this way. He strode out of the shack, swung onto his horse, and rode not west toward his ranch, but directly into the heart of Redemption Gulch. He rode like a man possessed, his face a thundercloud. He dismounted in front of the general store, throwing the reins over the hitching post with a violence that made the wood groan. He strode inside, his spurs ringing like alarm bells on the floorboards. The store fell silent. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, a look of triumph on her face that curdled into fear when she saw his expression. The preacher was there, as was the sheriff, sipping coffee. "Where is she?" Emmett's voice was low, dangerous. It was not the voice of a drifter. It was the voice of a man who owned the ground they stood on. "I'm sure I don't know who you mean," Mrs. Gable said, trying to regain her composure. "The baker," he snarled. "The woman you hounded out of town with your vicious, empty lies." "Now see here," the preacher began, puffing out his chest. "That woman's character was questionable. We have a moral duty to protect this town." Emmett turned on him, a look of such contempt on his face that the preacher took a step back. "You talk of morals? You, who use God as a shield for your own spite? Her bread is more honest than any word spoken in this town for 10 years. Her hands are cleaner than your soul will ever be." He turned his attention back to Mrs. Gable. "And you talk of debts. Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about the interest rates you charge men who can't read the ledgers you keep. Let's talk about the way you weigh your flour with a heavy thumb. You think I don't know what you are?" He took a step closer, leaning over the counter. "I am the man who holds the note on this entire town. Mrs. Gable, I own this store. I own the land your house is on. And I am telling you that your tenure here is over. You will be on the noon stagecoach, or I will have the sheriff here escort you out." The sheriff, a man who knew which side his own bread was buttered on, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Mrs. Gable's face had gone white with shock and fury. The townspeople who had gathered at the door gasped. It was in that moment of stunned silence that the door opened. Vashti stood there, her bundle in her hand, her face pale but her eyes clear. She had only made it to the edge of the creek before her courage had failed her. Running was what her husband had done. It wasn't who she was. She had turned back, not to be rescued, but to face them, to speak her own truth, no matter the consequence. She had not expected to walk into this. Emmett saw her, and the rage in his face softened into a raw, desperate relief. He had fought for her, and now here she was, ready to fight for herself. Vashti walked past the gawking crowd and stood in the center of the room. She looked not at Emmett, but at the faces of the people who had judged her. "My name is Vashti," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "My husband was a gambler. He made mistakes, and he left debts I cannot pay. That is his story. It is not mine. My story is in my hands. It is in the bread I bake and the work I do. I have harmed no one in this town. I have asked for nothing from you but a chance. Mrs. Gable is right about one thing. You don't know what kind of hands have touched my bread." She held up her hands, palms out. They were calloused, flour-dusted, and steady. These are the hands of a woman who has lost everything and is trying to build it back, one loaf at a time. They are honest hands. She finally looked at Emmett, her heart in her eyes. "I am sorry for the trouble I brought you," she whispered. He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood before her. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. He didn't say a word. He just held them, his thumbs stroking the backs of her knuckles, a public declaration more powerful than any speech. He was choosing her, in front of everyone. He was holding her story in his hands and claiming it as his own. The rescue was complete. He had saved her from exile, and she had saved him from his silence. They stood together, a united front against the judgment of the world, and in that moment, the town of Redemption Gulch knew it had been redeemed, not by a preacher's sermon, but by a baker's integrity and a drifter's love. 6 months later, the dust of Redemption Gulch had settled differently. The sign on the general store now read, "Vashti's Bakery." The inside had been transformed. Where shelves of overpriced goods and stale biscuits once stood, there were now long wooden tables displaying racks of cooling bread, pies, and cakes. Her adobe oven had been painstakingly moved and installed in a new, brick-lined hearth at the back, its warmth and scent filling the entire building, the true heart of the town. Mrs. Gable had left on the noon stagecoach that day, her face a mask of bitter defeat. The preacher found his congregation dwindling, his moral authority withered under the light of his own hypocrisy. The town, shamed into a new kind of honesty, had slowly, cautiously come around. They had tasted Vashti's bread, and in it they had tasted something of her spirit, resilient, warm, and true. They were her customers now, her neighbors. Vashti was no longer the outcast. She was the center. Children would stop by for a sweet roll on their way to school. Ranchers would buy a week's worth of bread on their way out to their herds. The women who had once whispered behind their hands now traded recipes and gossip with her over the counter. She had found a home, not by running from her past, but by standing her ground and claiming her future. Emmett was a changed man. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened. The fortress of his grief had been dismantled, brick by silent brick. He no longer lived in isolation on his ranch. Most evenings he could be found in the bakery, sitting at a small table he'd built for her, sipping coffee and watching her work. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, steadying warmth. He was a man who had forgotten how to live in the world, and she had shown him the way back. Not with words, but with the simple, life-affirming act of breaking bread. This evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, they sat on the porch of the small house that had been built behind the bakery. It was a proper house, with glass windows and a sturdy roof. A home. Emmett had overseen its construction himself, his hands helping to raise the walls that would shelter her. He sat beside her on the porch swing he'd hung last week, the chains creaking in a gentle rhythm. He reached over and took her hand. His was large and calloused from a life of hard work. Hers was smaller, dusted with a perpetual film of flour. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit. "The fire's still going," she said softly, looking at the warm glow coming from the bakery's windows, where a new batch of bread was rising for the morning. He squeezed her hand. "I never doubted it would," he said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes clear and full of a quiet, profound love that needed no grand declaration. He had been a man adrift, a ghost haunting his own life, and she had anchored him. She had been a woman with nothing but a recipe and a memory, and he had given her a kingdom. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The air smelled of sagebrush and cooling dust, and faintly of yeast and sugar from the bakery. It was the smell of their life together. Vashti leaned her head on his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her so deep and complete, it felt like she could finally exhale a breath she'd been holding her entire life. She was home. They both were. This shared peace was a testament to the battles they had won, both in public and within their own hearts. For Vashti, every loaf she sold was a small victory, a reaffirmation of her worth. For Emmett, every evening spent on this porch was a defiance of the grief that had once consumed him. Their love story wasn't one of flowery words or grand passions, but of quiet acts of service, of mutual respect, of finding solace in another's presence. It was a love as sturdy and wholesome as the bread she baked. The town had learned from them. It was a quieter place now, more given to kindness than to judgment. The simple act of a powerful man choosing to value a woman everyone else had discarded had shifted something fundamental in the social landscape. Honesty and hard work had become the new currency, and Vashti's bakery was its mint. Later that night, as she was banking the fire in the oven for the night, Emmett came to stand behind her. He didn't speak, just rested his hands on her shoulders, his warmth seeping into her. She leaned back against his solid frame, her hands covered in flour, her heart full. "You know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "that first day, when you tasted that slice of bread, what did you think?" He was silent for a long moment, his chin resting on the top of her head. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against her back. "I thought," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed, "that I had forgotten what it felt like to be home. Until that moment." She turned in his arms, her flour-dusted hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his eyes, seeing the man he was, the man he had been, and the man he would be with her. The powerful rancher, the broken widower, the silent protector. He was all of it. And he was hers. She rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft, doughy kiss that tasted of warmth and forever. It was a promise sealed, a story come full circle. The drifter had found his anchor, and the baker had found her home. And in the heart of the unforgiving West, they had built a life, one slice of bread at a time.